A tiny hand broke the surface of the churning mud. Fingers splayed in desperate plea. 5-year-old Emily Harper's blonde hair was matted with clay, her blue eyes wide with terror as the quicksand pulled her deeper. Beside her, only the German shepherd's muzzle remained visible, nostrils flaring frantically for air. "Hold on, child." Frank Donovan's weathered voice carried across the mud flat. The old veteran limped forward, makeshift rescue pole clutched in arthritic hands, sweat beading on his sun-spotted forehead. Emily's lips moved silently. Not a sound had passed them in months, but her grip on Scout's collar never loosened, even as the mud claimed another inch of them both. The quicksand bubbled ominously around them, revealing something metallic beneath. Frank's eyes narrowed at the glint. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, recognizing what lay beneath their sinking bodies. "That's been buried for 40 years. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Willow Creek. Arizona had always been a place of extremes. Dust Bowl dry for 9 months, then transformed by summer monsoons that carved the red earth into treacherous pockets of danger. The locals called the area behind Harper Road the Sinking Grounds, a deceptive stretch of land that turned deadly after heavy rains, its surface hardening under sun while beneath remained quicksand waiting to claim the unwary. Emily Harper knew she wasn't supposed to be near the sinking grounds. Her mother had warned her countless times, especially since the unusually heavy rains this season. But 5-year-olds rarely calculate risk, particularly those carrying wounds too deep for their small frames. Emily hadn't spoken a word since February, not since she'd overheard her father tell her mother he wasn't coming back. The doctors called it selective mutism, triggered by trauma. Sarah Harper called it heartbreak. In Emily's silent world, Scout had become everything, the German shepherd had appeared 3 months ago, materializing like a guardian spirit at their back door. No collar, no chip, but impeccably trained. Sarah had posted found dog notices that nobody answered. Emily had left her bedroom door open for the first time in weeks. Their house sat at the edge of Sycamore Street, where the newer developments gave way to older properties with larger lots. The newest of these belonged to Frank Donovan, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran who'd moved in last week and promptly erected a no trespassing sign. The neighbors had tried their usual welcome baskets and invitations, but Frank's gruff, "Much obliged, but I keep to myself," had established clear boundaries. Frank's property backed onto the same stretch of troublesome land as the Harpers. Though he'd spent his first days in town reinforcing his fence line rather than introducing himself, the locals had already labeled him that cantankerous old soldier. But they didn't see how his hands trembled when unexpected noises startled him, or how he studied the neighborhood children's faces with a mixture of longing and sorrow when he thought no one was watching. Sarah worked night shifts at Willow Creek Memorial, leaving Emily with Mrs. Abernathy next door during working hours. But on her days off, Sarah's exhaustion meant deep afternoon naps, which was exactly when Emily had taken to slipping out the back door with Scout, exploring the forbidden territories beyond their yard. The afternoon sun beat down on Emily's bare shoulders as she crept past her mother's bedroom window. Inside, Sarah Harper's exhausted form lay sprawled across the bed, still in her scrubs from the overnight shift. Emily glanced up at the quietly humming air conditioner, knowing its white noise would mask the sound of the back gate's squeak. Scout sat patiently at the gate, his intelligent eyes watching Emily work the latch with small, determined fingers. Despite her silence, There existed between them a communication deeper than words. A slight tilt of her head was all it took for the German shepherd to understand they were embarking on another secret adventure. Emily remembered the first time she'd seen Scout. She'd been sitting on the back porch steps, tears sliding silently down her cheeks after overhearing her mother sobbing on the phone to Aunt Jen. "How do I tell her Daddy's got a new baby coming?" Sarah had whispered. Emily had frozen, her 5-year-old heart unable to process this final betrayal. That's when Scout had appeared at the edge of their property, thin and dirty but moving with purpose straight toward her, as if he'd been searching for her specifically. He'd sat exactly 3 feet away, respectful but attentive, until Emily had finally extended her small hand. The dog had gently rested his muzzle against her palm, and something inside Emily's broken world had clicked back into place. Scout hadn't tried to make her talk. He'd simply been there, solid and real when everything else felt like quicksand. The memory warmed Emily as they made their way along the narrow deer path that wound behind the row of houses. Scout stayed close, occasionally glancing back as if to confirm they weren't venturing too far. Emily carried a small backpack with 2 juice boxes and a peanut butter sandwich cut in half, one portion for her and one for Scout. Their usual picnic spot was beneath a sprawling cottonwood tree just shy of the warning signs marking the sinking grounds. Today, however, Scout's behavior changed as they approached their destination. His ears perked forward, and his body tensed with sudden interest. Before Emily could react, he'd darted ahead, chasing something she couldn't see into the restricted area. Scout! The word formed in her mind but died before reaching her lips. Emily stood frozen, watching as her only friend disappeared into the forbidden zone. Her hands opened and closed in distress, her breath coming faster. Scout never disobeyed. Something was wrong. Emily took 3 hesitant steps forward, stopping at the faded sign that read, "Danger, unstable ground, keep out." Her mother's warnings echoed in her head, but the thought of losing Scout terrified her more than any quicksand. She ducked under the sign, following the dog's paw prints in the dusty earth. She found Scout near a patch of ground that looked different from the surrounding area, darker, with an unnatural sheen to its surface. The German shepherd was already leg-deep in the deceptive mud, pawing frantically at something Emily couldn't see. When he tried to back up, the suction held him fast, and panic flashed in his eyes. Emily's silent world suddenly seemed even quieter as she realized Scout was trapped. She grabbed a fallen branch, extending it toward him while staying on firmer ground. Scout strained toward it, but remained just out of reach. The more he struggled, the faster he sank. The quicksand now reached Scout's belly. His whimpers turned desperate. Eyes locked on Emily with an intelligence that recognized the danger. What struck Emily's heart wasn't just fear in those eyes, but trust, absolute faith that somehow this small human would save him. Emily knew she shouldn't step onto the treacherous ground. Even at 5, she understood the basic physics of quicksand from the nature shows she watched with her mother. But as Scout's breathing grew labored, rational thought gave way to desperate love. She sat down, removed her sneakers, and cautiously tested the edge of the quicksand with one foot. The mud felt cool and slick, grabbing instantly at her toes. Emily took a deep breath and stepped fully into the trap, feeling the earth swallow her small legs to mid-calf in seconds. She moved with deliberate slowness, remembering the documentaries that said quick movements only made you sink faster. "It's okay, Scout," she thought, wishing her voice would work. "I'm coming." Each step was a battle, the mud reluctantly releasing one foot only when the other pushed deeper. By the time she reached Scout, the quicksand had claimed her up to her knees and the dog up to his chest. Emily wrapped her arms around Scout's neck, trying to distribute their weight, but instead of stabilizing, they both sank further. Panic fluttered in her chest as Emily realized they were now both trapped. Scout whined softly, trying to keep his muzzle above the surface. The quicksand had a horrible, insistent pull, drawing them gradually downward no matter how still they remained. Emily's eyes burned with tears as she clung to Scout, her only anchor in a world that kept taking pieces of her heart. A mile away, Frank Donovan walked his property line, checking the fence posts he'd reinforced yesterday. The morning air still held coolness, the kind that made his old joints ache less than usual. He preferred these early hours before the neighborhood stirred, before he had to guard against unexpected interactions and the inevitable questions about his service or his scars. Frank's routine was interrupted by a sound carried on the breeze, not quite human, not quite animal. He cocked his head, listening more intently. There it came again, a distressed whimper that raised the hair on his neck. Some instincts never faded. Even after 40 years of civilian life, he hesitated, torn between investigating and minding his own business. Willow Creek had plenty of other residents who could help whatever was in trouble. He'd come here specifically to be left alone, to finish his days in quiet solitude. Yet something about that sound pulled at memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. "Damn it all," he muttered, grabbing his walking stick and heading toward the sound. "Just going to look. That's all." Frank moved with the careful efficiency of a man who'd learned to navigate difficult terrain long before his joints began betraying him. As he approached the edge of his property, he spotted the small figure and the dog in the distance, already partly submerged in the notorious sinking grounds. His heart slammed against his ribs. "Hey," he shouted, his voice rusty from disuse. "Don't move." The little girl's head whipped around, her eyes wide with fear and hope. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. The German shepherd's ears pricked forward at Frank's voice, an oddly familiar response that triggered something in his memory. Frank surveyed the situation with the quick assessment of someone trained to evaluate danger. Both child and dog were sinking in one of the deepest quicksand pockets, already too far gone for simple extraction. He'd need leverage, rope, something to distribute weight. His military training kicked in as he scanned for resources. A fallen cottonwood branch, sturdy enough to support weight. His belt, leather, old but strong. The plank near his fence line, left over from yesterday's repairs. "Hold on, kid," he called, gathering his makeshift rescue equipment. "Don't struggle." Frank's arthritic hands worked with muscle memory, lashing the plank to the branch with his belt to create a crude but functional rescue bridge. Every second counted. The girl and dog were sinking incrementally with each passing moment. As he approached the edge of the quicksand, Frank felt the old familiar tightness in his chest. Not now, he thought, pushing back against the threat of his heart condition. Not when they need me. What struck him most was the little girl's silence, Despite her obvious terror, she made no sound, no cries, no calls for help, just those huge blue eyes locked onto his, a drowning person sighting a distant shore. "I'm coming to get you," Frank said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "But you need to stay real still. Understand?" The child nodded, her arms still wrapped protectively around the German shepherd. Frank noticed how, even in their dire situation, she seemed more concerned about the dog than herself. The observation triggered something deep in his memory. Another time, another place, another bond between human and canine that defied self-preservation. Frank edged his makeshift rescue platform toward the quicksand, distributing his weight carefully as decades-old training resurfaced in his movements. The German shepherd watched him with an intensity that struck Frank as oddly familiar, not the panicked stare of a trapped animal, but the focused gaze of a working dog assessing a situation. "Easy now," Frank called, his voice dropping into the commanding tone he hadn't used since Vietnam. "Stay steady." To his astonishment, the dog's posture changed immediately. Despite being chest-deep in quicksand, Scout's ears perked forward, and his struggling ceased. The response was so immediate, so disciplined, that Frank felt a chill run down his spine. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's military training if I ever saw it." Frank extended the plank closer, careful not to disturb the deadly surface more than necessary. The little girl's face was streaked with mud and tears, but her grip on the dog remained unwavering. As Frank drew near enough to make eye contact, he saw a determination in those young eyes that reminded him of other soldiers, men who wouldn't leave their comrades behind, no matter the cost. "I'm going to need you to take my hand," Frank said, reaching out. "But you'll have to let go of the dog first." The girl's eyes widened in alarm. She shook her head vehemently, clutching Scout tighter, even as they both sank another inch. "Listen, sweetheart," Frank tried again, softening his tone. "I'll get him too, I promise. But I need to get you safe first." The girl remained immovable, her jaw set in stubborn refusal. The quicksand had now reached her chest, and Scout's efforts to keep his muzzle above the surface were becoming increasingly desperate. Frank's mind raced. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional wisdom said save the human first. But something about the girl's devotion to the animal struck a chord in his weathered heart. They would both die if he couldn't find a way to save them together. A fragment of memory surfaced techniques from his days as a canine handler in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Frank hadn't worked with dogs since losing his partner, Sergeant, in '71, but some knowledge never fades completely. "Attention!" Frank barked suddenly, using the German command, "Achtung!" The effect was immediate and startling, despite his predicament. Scout's head snapped up, eyes locking onto Frank with newfound recognition. The dog's whimpering ceased, replaced by alert attention. "Halt!" Frank continued, using the stay command. "Wharton." Scout became eerily still, conserving energy and maintaining his position as best he could in the clutching mud. The girl looked between Frank and Scout in astonishment, clearly surprised by her dog's response. "That's it," Frank encouraged, moving the plank closer. "Your dog's got training, young lady, military training, and that means he knows how to follow orders that'll save his life." A flash of understanding crossed the girl's face. For the first time, She seemed to comprehend that Frank might actually know how to save them both. Frank worked quickly, unfastening his belt from the rescue apparatus and fashioning it into a makeshift harness. "I'm going to slip this around both of you," he explained, demonstrating the motion. "When I say pull, you hug that dog tight and don't let go. Understand?" The girl nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. Frank inched forward on the plank, stretching to loop the leather belt around the girl's small shoulders and under Scout's front legs. The quicksand made obscene sucking sounds as he disturbed its surface, a reminder of the danger literally pulling at his rescue subjects. As Frank secured the makeshift harness, his fingers brushed against Scout's neck. Years of handling military dogs made him instinctively check for identification tags beneath the mud-matted fur. What his fingers found made his heart stutter, a small raised patch of skin with a pattern he recognized immediately. "Son of a gun," he whispered, recognizing the tattoo system used for military working dogs. His mind raced with implications as he finished securing the harness. This wasn't just any trained dog. This was a service animal with official credentials. In the distance, a siren wailed the flash flood warning system Willow Creek had installed after 3 teenagers drowned 5 years ago. The sound added urgency to an already desperate situation. "We've got to move now," Frank said, bracing himself to pull. "Floodwaters will be heading this way." As he gathered his strength for the first tug, the little girl's mouth opened. For a moment, nothing happened then. In a voice rusty from disuse, she whispered 5 words that stopped Frank cold. "He's my only friend." The simple declaration, clearly difficult for the child to voice, struck Frank with unexpected force. This wasn't just a girl who loved her pet. This was someone who'd found in this animal the only steady presence in a chaotic world. Frank knew that feeling intimately, had lived it in the jungles of Vietnam, with Sargent at his side, when all other certainties disappeared. "Then we'll save him too," Frank promised, his voice rough with emotion. "That's what friends do." He began the arduous process of extraction, pulling steadily while instructing Scout with military commands. To his amazement, the dog responded perfectly, moving in coordination with his efforts rather than fighting against them. This wasn't coincidence or good luck. This was specialized training. As Scout's body began to emerge from the quicksand, Frank noticed something else, a specific pattern to the dog's movements that triggered memories buried for decades. The way Scout kept his head positioned to protect the girl, the particular angle of his body, these were hallmarks of Sargent's bloodline and training methodology. "Vorwärts," Frank commanded forward, and Scout pushed with renewed effort, helping to free himself and Emily from the mud's grasp. The sound of voices and footsteps approached from the direction of the neighborhood. Frank glanced up to see 3 teenage boys cresting the small rise, smartphones already raised to record the unfolding drama. "Hey, don't just stand there filming," Frank shouted, his drill sergeant voice returning with full force. "Get over here and help." The teens hesitated, clearly more interested in documenting than participating in the rescue. One boy actually stepped closer to get a better angle, careful to keep his new sneakers away from the mud. "I said now, soldier!" Frank bellowed, the command so powerful that the lead teenager pocketed his phone reflexively and hurried forward. "What do we do?" the boy asked, suddenly looking much younger than his 16 or 17 years. "Grab this end and pull when I say," Frank instructed, passing the end of his makeshift harness to the teen. "And tell your buddies to form a human chain back to solid ground." As the teenagers reluctantly complied, Frank returned his attention to Emily and Scout. The German Shepherd's disciplined response to commands had confirmed what the tattoo suggested: this dog had connections to military or police training. But there was something more. Something in the way Scout moved and responded that nagged at Frank's memory. When Scout was finally pulled free enough that his back legs gained purchase on more solid ground, Frank caught a better glimpse of the tattoo under the mud. The identification pattern made his breath catch not just any military dog program, but the specific code used for the breeding program that had continued Sargent's bloodline after Vietnam. "That's impossible," Frank murmured, as Scout heaved himself and Emily further from danger. "That's Sargent's training response." The realization hit him like physical blow. After all these years, after all the darkness and solitude, was it possible he was looking at a descendant of his own war dog, the dog who had saved his life more times than he could count before making the ultimate sacrifice? Emily and Scout finally reached the edge of the quicksand, both covered in gray mud, but very much alive. As Scout shook himself, sending mud flying in all directions, Frank noticed something else, a faint white marking on the dog's chest, shaped like a star, just like Sargent's. "Form a line! Grab hands!" Frank ordered the teenagers, who snapped to attention under his commanding tone. The oldest boy, a lanky redhead wearing a Willow Creek High football jersey, finally pocketed his phone and extended a hand toward the mud-covered child. "I got her, sir," he said, his initial reluctance giving way to genuine concern as he saw Emily's condition. The girl allowed herself to be pulled to safety, but her eyes never left Scout. The German Shepherd shook violently, sending mud in all directions, before pressing himself against Emily's side as if to reassure himself she was truly safe. "Someone call 911, Frank directed, his breathing more labored than he wanted to admit. The exertion had taken its toll, and a familiar tightness squeezed his chest. He reached discreetly into his pocket, fingering the nitroglycerin pills he carried everywhere. "Already streaming, dude," said the youngest teen, a skinny boy with braces who was still filming with his phone. "Got like 50 viewers already." Frank snatched the device from the boy's hands. "This isn't some damn entertainment," he growled. "This is a child nearly dying. Call 911 proper or give me the phone." The teenager's face flushed. "Sorry, sir," he mumbled, taking back his phone and dialing emergency services. Frank turned his attention back to Emily and Scout. The little girl sat silently on the ground, her arms around the dog's neck. Despite being covered in drying mud from head to toe, she seemed remarkably composed for a child who had just faced death. Scout, meanwhile, remained vigilant, his posture protective rather than traumatized. "You got a name, little one?" Frank asked, crouching, despite the protest of his knees. Emily looked up at him but didn't speak. The brief words she'd uttered in the quicksand seemed to have used up her voice again. "She don't talk," volunteered the red-headed teen. "That's Emily Harper from down on Sycamore. My mom works with her mom at the hospital. She hasn't spoken since her dad left." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, she talked to me out there," he said quietly. "When it mattered most." A commotion erupted from the direction of the neighborhood as a woman's voice called out in panic. "Emily, Emily!" Sarah Harper appeared at the top of the small rise, her scrubs wrinkled from sleep and her blonde hair the same shade as her daughter's wild around her face. When she spotted Emily sitting in the mud, her knees visibly buckled before she recovered and ran toward them. "Oh, my God! Emily!" Sarah dropped to her knees, heedless of the mud, and gathered her daughter into her arms. "What happened? Are you hurt? Why are you out here?" The questions tumbled out between sobs of relief. Scout whined softly, nudging himself between mother and daughter as if to remind them of his presence. Sarah's expression hardened when she saw the dog. "That animal," she began, anger edging into her voice. "I told you he's too big for you to handle alone. Emily, look what happened. You could have died." Emily's face crumpled, and she clutched Scout's fur more tightly. Frank cleared his throat, drawing Sarah's attention for the first time. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his head respectfully. "Your daughter didn't get into trouble following the dog. She went in to save him. Bravest thing I've seen in years." Sarah looked up, taking in Frank's mud-splattered clothes and weathered face. Recognition dawned slowly. "You're the new neighbor, Mr. Donovan." "Frank," he corrected. "And before you go blaming the dog, you should know he's not just any stray. That animal has military training, specialized training." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Before Frank could explain, the wail of sirens announced the arrival of emergency services. A sheriff's department SUV crested the hill, followed closely by an ambulance. Sheriff Dale Matthews, a barrel-chested man with a salt-and-pepper mustache, emerged from the vehicle with his hand resting instinctively on his service weapon. "What in tarnation is going on here?" he demanded, surveying the mud-covered group. One of the teenagers eagerly stepped forward. The little girl and her dog were stuck in the quicksand. "Sheriff, the old dude saved them." Sheriff Matthews' eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, lingering on Frank longer than necessary. "Donovan," he said with a nod that was neither friendly nor hostile. "Didn't expect to see you involved in local affairs so soon." There was something in the sheriff's tone that suggested prior knowledge of Frank. But before Frank could respond, the paramedics pushed forward to examine Emily. "I'm fine," Sarah insisted, her nurse's training evident in her quick assessment. "Check my daughter first." As the paramedics began examining Emily, Scout grew increasingly agitated. He circled the group, whining softly and returning repeatedly to Frank's side as if seeking instruction. Frank observed the dog's behavior with growing certainty about his origins. "Sheriff," Frank said quietly, moving away from the group. "That dog has a military identification tattoo. Inside right ear, K9 program markers." Sheriff Matthews raised an eyebrow. "And you'd know this how—" "Vietnam," Frank replied simply. "K9 handler, 47th Scout Dog Platoon. That animal's got the same training patterns as my partner did." The sheriff's demeanor shifted subtly. He studied Scout with new interest. "Any chance he's connected to that military working dog that went missing from Fort Huachuca last year? The brass was all over us looking for some valuable breeding animal." Frank's pulse quickened. "Could be. The bloodline markers I saw match my old partner's descendants. The Army continued Sergeant's lineage after he died saving my unit. His offspring were too valuable to lose." As they spoke, Scout became even more restless. The dog returned to the edge of the quicksand, barking insistently at something beneath the surface. The motion of the rescue had disturbed the mud, and a metallic glint was now more prominent than before. "What's he found?" Sheriff Matthews asked, moving cautiously toward the edge. Frank squinted against the sun's reflection. "Looks like metal. Part of a vehicle, maybe." The sheriff's expression changed instantly. "Everyone back," he ordered, his hand moving to his radio. "Donovan, get that dog away from there." Frank whistled sharply, using the recall command that had worked earlier. "Higher, Scout. Higher." Scout responded immediately, returning to Frank's side but maintaining his alert posture, eyes fixed on the quicksand. Sheriff Matthews spoke rapidly into his radio, requesting additional units and equipment. Sarah Harper looked up from where she sat with Emily, confusion and concern written across her face. "What's happening?" Sheriff Matthews approached carefully. "Ma'am, we may have found something significant. I need to ask you all to move back to the perimeter while we investigate." "Found what?" Sarah asked, pulling Emily closer. The sheriff hesitated. "Could be the Colson vehicle," he said finally. "Been missing for 22 years. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered. Even the teenagers looked shocked rather than excited by this development. "Richard Colson," Sarah whispered, the color draining from her face. "The town benefactor." Frank watched the reactions carefully, noting how the atmosphere had shifted from rescue to something far more tense. The name meant nothing to him as a newcomer, but clearly held significance for everyone else present. "Mom," Emily's voice, small but clear, broke through the tension. Everyone turned in surprise to look at the mud-covered child. "Is Scout in trouble?" Sarah's mouth opened in shock at hearing her daughter speak unprompted for the first time in months. "No, sweetie," she managed. "Scout's not in trouble." Emily nodded and returned to silence. But the brief words had transformed her mother's demeanor completely. Sarah looked from her daughter to the dog with new understanding, then up at Frank with something approaching gratitude. As additional sheriff's vehicles arrived and deputies began establishing a perimeter around the quicksand, Frank found himself standing awkwardly between groups, not quite part of the emergency response team, yet no longer an uninvolved bystander. Scout stayed pressed against his leg, a familiar weight that awakened long-dormant muscle memory. "Mr. Donovan," Sarah approached, Emily's hand in hers. "Thank you for saving my daughter. And Scout," she added, with a glance at the dog. "I didn't realize. I've been so focused on our problems. I never considered he might be something special." Frank nodded uncomfortably, unused to gratitude. "Just did what anyone would do." "But they didn't," Sarah pointed out, looking meaningfully at the neighborhood adults who were only now arriving, drawn by commotion rather than emergency. "You did. And somehow you got Emily to speak again." Before Frank could respond, a young deputy approached them. "Sheriff wants to talk to you both," he said. "Something about the dog identifying the vehicle." Frank and Sarah exchanged glances before following the deputy to where Sheriff Matthews stood consulting with an older man who had arrived in an unmarked county vehicle. The man wore civilian clothes but carried himself with unmistakable law enforcement bearing. "Donovan," Sheriff Matthews beckoned. "This is Detective Collins, Cold Case Division. He has some questions about what you and the dog found." Detective Collins, a lean man with shrewd eyes and a receding hairline, extended his hand. "Vietnam vet, right K-9 unit." Frank nodded, shaking the offered hand. "What's this about?" "The Colson case was my first assignment," Collins explained. "Never solved it. Richard Colson disappeared after a town council meeting in 2001. His Lincoln Navigator was never recovered. If that's his vehicle under there, he gestured toward the quicksand where equipment was now being set up. It changes everything about the case. Frank felt Scout tense beside him. The dog's focus remained unnaturally fixed on the quicksand, his training evident in every line of his body. "Your dog seems mighty interested," Detective Collins observed. "Almost like he knows what's down there." "He's not my dog," Frank began, but stopped when Scout pressed more firmly against his leg. The familiar pressure, the unwavering attention, it was too similar to his old partner to be coincidence. "The reaction could be to human remains," he said instead. "Military dogs are trained to alert on them." Collins and Matthews exchanged significant looks. "We never found a body," Collins said quietly. "Always assumed he'd run off with town funds. There was money missing from accounts he managed." As they spoke, a recovery team had begun working to secure the area around the partially exposed vehicle. Metal poles were driven into more solid ground, creating anchoring points for the winch system they were assembling. "Mom, Scout is scared," Emily said suddenly, her voice stronger than before. All four adults turned to look at the little girl, surprised by both her speech and her insight. Frank studied Scout more carefully and realized Emily was right. Beneath the professional alertness was a tension he recognized. Not fear for himself, but concern for his humans. "She's right," Frank confirmed. "He's sensing something he doesn't like." Sheriff Matthews frowned. "Like what?" "The body." Frank shook his head slowly. "No. Something else." He looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers, many filming with their phones despite deputies' requests to stop. "He's trained to recognize threats, and something's got him worried." As if confirming Frank's assessment, Scout let out a low growl, not directed at the quicksand, but toward the perimeter where spectators had gathered. Frank followed the dog's gaze, scanning the faces in the crowd. Most showed the expected emotions: curiosity, excitement, concern. But one man standing slightly apart displayed something different, a tightly controlled tension that Frank recognized from his military days. "Sheriff," Frank said quietly. 3 o'clock position. Man in the blue baseball cap. Know him." Matthews glanced casually in the indicated direction. "That's Greg Bentley, city council member. Why?" "Your dog doesn't like him," Collins observed, watching Scout's continued focus on the man. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Greg was Richard Colson's assistant before he disappeared. He took over management of the Colson Foundation afterward. This new information settled over the group like a physical weight. Collins' expression hardened. "Interesting that he showed up so quickly for what should be just a routine rescue." "Nothing routine about finding a missing vehicle after 22 years, Matthews pointed out. Frank remained silent, watching the interaction between Scout and the distant figure of Greg Bentley. The dog's body language conveyed a clear message to anyone trained to read it: recognition and alert, not just general unease. "I think," Frank said slowly, "you might want to keep Mr. Bentley around for questioning when they recover that vehicle." Sheriff Matthews studied Frank's face. "You getting some kind of special insight from the dog, Donovan?" "Military working dogs don't forget their training," Frank replied, "and they don't alert without reason." Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from the recovery team. "We've got visual confirmation. It's a Navigator, early 2000s model. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Greg Bentley's figure suddenly straightened, then began moving casually but purposefully toward the parking area where vehicles were haphazardly left by arriving spectators. "Looks like your dog was right about something," Collins muttered, already moving to intercept Bentley. "Matthews, you might want to send someone to secure his residence before he gets any ideas about cleaning house." As law enforcement sprung into action, Frank found himself oddly removed from the unfolding drama. His focus remained on Emily and Scout, the unlikely pair who had inadvertently triggered what appeared to be the resolution of a decades-old mystery. Sarah seemed equally overwhelmed. "I can't believe this," she whispered, pulling Emily closer. "All this time, the answer was just sitting under mud in our backyard." "Sometimes the truth stays buried until the right moment," Frank said. "Or until the right person comes along to uncover it." Emily looked up at him with those solemn blue eyes that seemed far older than her 5 years. "Like Scout," she said simply. "He knew." Frank nodded, dropping to one knee despite the protest of his joints. "Your Scout is a very special dog, Emily. The kind they don't make very often." "Is he yours?" Emily asked directly, surprising Frank with her perception. "No," Frank answered honestly. "But I think maybe I knew his family a long time ago." Emily considered this with the gravity only children can bring to important matters. "He needs a family," she declared. "He found me, but he knew you too." The sky darkened ominously as recovery operations continued around the partially exposed vehicle. The flash flood warning that had sounded earlier wasn't just a precaution. Heavy rain in the mountains was sending water coursing through the desert arroyos toward Willow Creek. Sheriff Matthews consulted frequently with his radio dispatcher, monitoring the flood's progress. "We've got about 40 minutes before this whole area is underwater," he announced to the recovery team. "Pick up the pace. People." Frank watched the increasing urgency of the operation with growing concern. The quicksand that had nearly claimed Emily and Scout would become even more dangerous when floodwaters arrived. Already he could see water beginning to seep into the depression from the far side, making the recovery effort more difficult by the minute. Sarah Harper had been convinced to take Emily to the waiting ambulance for a proper medical examination. Though the little girl had refused to go without Scout, the paramedics had reluctantly allowed the mud-covered German shepherd to accompany them, recognizing that separating them might cause more trauma than it prevented. Frank stood at the perimeter, feeling increasingly unnecessary yet unable to leave. His role in the rescue was complete, but something kept him rooted to the spot, a nagging sense of unfinished business that he couldn't quite identify. Scout's reaction to the man named Bentley troubled him, as did the dog's obvious military training. The coincidence seemed too great a dog with connections to his old partner's bloodline, appearing in this small town just as Frank arrived, leading to the discovery of a decades-old crime. "Mr. Donovan," a deputy approached, clipboard in hand. "We need your statement about the rescue and discovery." Frank nodded, following the young officer to a quieter spot away from the commotion. As he recounted the morning's events, his attention kept drifting to the recovery operation. They had attached cables to the exposed portion of the vehicle and were using a winch system to slowly extract it from the quicksand. "You military?" the deputy asked, noticing Frank's distraction. "Long time ago," Frank replied. "Vietnam. Canine handler." The deputy nodded respectfully. "My grandfather was there." Never talked about it much. Not much to say, Frank answered automatically. The standard response he'd given for decades when people asked about his service. A sudden commotion from the ambulance drew their attention. Emily had emerged, still wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, and was pointing urgently toward the quicksand. Scout stood beside her, barking sharply, not the excited yapping of a pet, but the focused alerts of a working dog. Frank moved toward them without thinking, his aging body protesting the sudden movement. "What is it?" he called. "Scout says there's someone still there," Emily shouted, her voice stronger and clearer than before. The unexpected volume from the previously silent child startled everyone within earshot. Sheriff Matthews approached quickly. "What's she talking about?" Frank watched Scout's behavior with growing concern. "The dog's alerting to something in the vehicle," he explained. "These recovery operations can sometimes shift remains." "No," Emily interrupted with surprising force. "Not old. Someone now." The certainty in her voice gave Frank pause. He studied Scout's posture and alerts more carefully, drawing on training from decades past. The dog wasn't displaying the behavior pattern for historical remains detection. This was an active alert. "Sheriff," Frank said urgently, "I think she might be right. That's a live alert pattern." Matthews looked skeptical, but signaled to the recovery team. "Hold up. We need to check for current occupancy before you move that vehicle further." The team paused their operations, looking confused. One of the recovery specialists waded closer to the partially exposed SUV, now visible enough to confirm it was indeed a Lincoln Navigator matching the description of Richard Colson's vehicle. "There's no way anyone's alive in there," the specialist called back. "This thing's been underwater for decades." "Just check it," Matthews ordered. As the specialist moved closer to the vehicle, Scout's barking intensified. Frank felt a familiar pressure building in his chest, the warning signs of his heart condition flaring under stress. He fumbled in his pocket for his medication, swallowing a pill dry as he watched the scene unfold. The recovery specialist reached the driver's side window, now partially cleared of mud, and peered inside. His body language changed instantly. "Jesus Christ," he shouted. "There's someone in here recent." The revelation sent the entire operation into overdrive. Sheriff Matthews barked orders into his radio, requesting additional medical support and forensic teams. Frank moved closer despite deputies' attempts to maintain the perimeter, drawn by Scout's continued alerting. "Let him through," Matthews called, recognizing Frank's expertise might be valuable. "The dog, too." Frank and Scout approached the edge of the quicksand, careful to stay on the more solid sections reinforced by the recovery team. The driver's side door of the Navigator was now partially visible, its window intact but obscured by decades of silt. "The water's rising faster than expected," one of the recovery team warned. "Flash floods picking up speed. We've got maybe 20 minutes. Not 40. Matthews swore under his breath. "We need to get that vehicle secured and whoever's inside out. Now." Frank studied the operation with a military tactician's eye. "Your winch setup won't work fast enough," he observed. "The angle's wrong, and the ground's getting more unstable by the minute." "You got a better idea, old-timer?" asked one of the younger deputies. Frank pointed to a large cottonwood about 30 feet from the edge. "Secure your main line there. Create a direct pull rather than the compound angle you're using. You'll get better leverage and faster extraction." The recovery team leader considered Frank's suggestion, then nodded reluctantly. "He's right. Reposition the primary anchor to that tree." As they scrambled to adjust their setup, Frank felt Emily appear beside him, having somehow slipped away from her mother's supervision. "Scout wants to help," she said quietly. Frank looked down at the determined child, still wrapped in her emergency blanket, mud caked in her blonde hair. "It's dangerous, Emily. The water's rising." Emily's blue eyes met his without wavering. "He can help. He's trained." Before Frank could respond, a shout came from the recovery team. One of their secondary anchors had pulled free as the ground grew more saturated, causing a cable to snap back dangerously. A recovery worker fell, crying out in pain as he clutched his arm. "That's it," Matthews declared. "Area's too unstable. Everyone back until we can get heavy equipment." "But there's someone in there," Emily protested, her voice rising with distress. Frank felt Scout tense beside him, the dog's eyes fixed on the partially exposed vehicle. A decision crystallized in his mind, one born of decades-old training and a lifetime of regrets. "Sheriff," Frank called. "The dog can take a rescue line across. It's what they're trained for." Matthews stared at Frank in disbelief. "You want to send the child's pet into that death trap?" "He's not a pet," Frank replied firmly. "He's a working dog with military training, and he's our best chance to save whoever's in that vehicle before the flood hits." The sheriff hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and necessity. The rising water had now reached the vehicle's tires, and the quicksand was becoming increasingly fluid. Standard rescue procedures would take too long. "I can't authorize risking a civilian animal," Matthews began. "He's not civilian," Frank interrupted. "And I'm not asking permission." He turned to the recovery team. "I need a lightweight line and a carabiner." To his surprise, the team leader immediately produced what he needed. "My brother was K-9 unit in Afghanistan," the man explained. "I've seen what these dogs can do." Frank knelt beside Scout, looking directly into the dog's intelligent eyes. "This is going to work," he told Emily, who stood anxiously at his side. "But I need you to give him permission. He's loyal to you now." Emily nodded solemnly. "Scout," she said, her small hand resting on the dog's head. "Help them." Frank quickly fashioned a secure harness using his belt and the rope, working with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar tasks under far worse conditions. As his fingers worked, he spoke to Scout in a mixture of English and German commands, establishing the parameters of the mission. "Straight line to the vehicle," Frank instructed, securing the lightweight rescue line to Scout's harness. "Touch nothing else. Danger zone. Understand." Scout's focus was absolute, his body quivering with readiness rather than fear. Frank felt a surge of pride mingled with déjà vu, the same sensation he'd experienced countless times with Sergeant in Vietnam. "If this doesn't work," Sarah began, having finally caught up with her daughter. "It'll work," Frank assured her with more confidence than he felt. "These dogs don't fail." With a final check of the harness, Frank gave the command, "Scout, vorwärts forward." A Scout launched himself across the treacherous surface with incredible precision, his path direct and purposeful. He distributed his weight instinctively, moving quickly enough to avoid sinking, but carefully enough to maintain stability. Every person present held their breath as the German shepherd navigated the deadly quicksand, the rescue line playing out behind him. "Good boy," Frank murmured, though Scout was too far away to hear. "Good boy." Scout reached the vehicle and immediately circled to the passenger side, where the window was partially broken. His behavior confirmed Frank's suspicion the dog was following air scent protocols, tracking the path of greatest oxygen exchange. "He's found an entry point," Frank called to the recovery team. "Secure the line." The team rushed to anchor Scout's line, creating a direct tether to the vehicle. Scout barked once the alert signal, then thrust his muzzle through the broken window, clearly trying to create a larger opening. "He's trying to increase airflow," Frank explained to the bewildered onlookers. "Whoever's in there needs oxygen." The water level continued to rise at an alarming rate. What had been dry ground 30 minutes earlier was now ankle-deep in swiftly moving water. The approaching flash flood was turning the rescue operation into a race against time. "We need to pull the vehicle now," the recovery team leader insisted. "Water's coming too fast." Frank watched Scout working frantically at the window, understanding the dog's urgency. "Give him one more minute," he pleaded. "He's making progress." As if hearing Frank's words, Scout redoubled his efforts, with a final powerful thrust. He broke through the remaining glass, creating an opening large enough to access the interior. His next action left everyone stunned instead of backing away. Scout wiggled through the opening and disappeared inside the vehicle. "What the hell is he doing?" Matthews demanded. "Making contact," Frank answered, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. "Military dogs are trained to reach victims when handlers can't." Emily suddenly clutched Frank's hand, her small fingers digging into his weathered skin. "He's scared," she whispered. "Really scared." Frank felt it too, an inexplicable connection to Scout's experience. The rising water, the trapped victim, the race against time, it all mirrored his final mission with Sargent in the flooded tunnels of Vietnam. History was repeating itself, and Frank was powerless to intervene directly. A mournful howl emerged from the vehicle, carrying across the water with chilling clarity. Scout had found something or someone inside. "Pull now!" Frank shouted, instinct overriding caution. The vehicle's flooding inside. The recovery team activated their winch, and the navigator began to move agonizingly slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as it broke free of the quicksand's grip. Water churned around it, brown and violent, carrying debris from upstream. As the vehicle emerged, a collective gasp rose from the onlookers. The navigator's condition told a story none had expected. The driver's side showed evidence of recent damage, not the decades-old deterioration they had anticipated, but fresh dents and paint transfer. "That's not 22 years of damage," Matthews observed. "That's recent." Before anyone could process this revelation, Scout appeared at the broken window, dragging something in his mouth. Frank recognized the behavior immediately extraction technique for an unconscious victim. "He's got someone," Frank shouted. "Get ready to receive." The vehicle had reached firmer ground, but remained partially submerged in the rising water. Scout struggled at the window, trying to pull his burden through the opening. Frank made a split-second decision, one his cardiologist would have vehemently opposed. "Hold my line," he ordered, handing his safety tether to the nearest deputy. Without waiting for permission, Frank waded into the flood, fighting the current to reach the vehicle. His chest burned with exertion, each step a battle against both water and age. "Donovan, get back here," Matthews shouted. But Frank ignored him, focused entirely on reaching Scout and whoever the dog had found. The cold water reached Frank's chest as he finally made it to the navigator. Scout whined with relief at his appearance. Still struggling with his burden, which Frank could now see, was a woman's arm. "I got you," Frank assured the dog, reaching through the window to assist. "Good boy, Scout, good boy." Together, they managed to maneuver the unconscious woman toward the window. She was young, mid-20s at most, and showed signs of both recent trauma and drugging. Frank's Vietnam-honed instincts cataloged her condition, automatically pulse-present but weak. Breathing shallow. Contusion on temple, ligature marks on wrists. "I need help here now," Frank shouted over the roaring water. "We've got a live victim." The ambulance doors slammed shut, siren wailing as it carried Frank and Jessica toward Willow Creek Memorial Hospital. Scout stood in the middle of the dirt access road, his intelligent eyes tracking the vehicle until it disappeared around the bend. Then, with purpose that belied his exhaustion, he trotted toward the second ambulance where Emily sat wrapped in a silver emergency blanket. "He needs to come with us," Emily insisted, her voice stronger than it had been in months as she reached for the German Shepherd. The paramedic exchanged glances with Sarah, who nodded permission despite her obvious concern about the mud-covered animal. "Just this once," the paramedic conceded, "but he'll need to be checked by animal control at the hospital." Scout leapt gracefully into the ambulance, positioning himself beside Emily with military precision, his eyes never leaving her face. The doors closed, and the second ambulance departed, leaving Sheriff Matthews and his deputies to secure the rapidly deteriorating scene. "Water's still rising," Matthews observed, watching the flood gradually consume what remained of the quicksand pit and its secrets. "Get the forensics team in here fast. Whatever evidence is in that vehicle, we need it before nature washes it all away." At Willow Creek Memorial, organized chaos reigned as the emergency team received Frank. His skin had taken on an alarming gray pallor during transport, and the cardiac monitor showed dangerous arrhythmias. "BP dropping, pulse irregular," called a nurse as they transferred him to a trauma bay. "Cardiac enzymes are elevated." Dr. Mendez, the hospital's only cardiologist, arrived moments later, taking one look at Frank's ECG before issuing rapid orders. "He's having a massive MI. Get him to cath lab now. Page the surgical team for backup." In the adjacent trauma bay, Jessica Colson received care for hypothermia, minor head trauma, and abrasions around her wrists where she had been bound. Unlike Frank, her condition stabilized quickly, her young body responding well to treatment. "She's lucky," muttered an ER doctor to a nurse. "Another 30 minutes in that water, we'd be looking at a very different outcome." In the waiting area, Sarah sat beside Emily, who refused to release her grip on Scout's fur despite the mud transferring to her clean blanket. The German Shepherd remained absolutely still, seeming to understand the gravity of the situation, when a hospital administrator approached with concerns about the animal's presence. Sarah rose to intercept him. "That dog saved my daughter's life today," she said quietly but firmly, "and helped rescue a kidnapping victim. He stays until animal control arrives." The administrator, recognizing Sarah as a valued staff member, reluctantly nodded and retreated. Sarah returned to Emily, kneeling to meet her daughter's eyes. "Emily, sweetie, can you tell me what happened today?" Emily stared back, her momentary verbal breakthrough seemingly exhausted. She opened her mouth, then closed it, the familiar wall of silence reasserting itself. Her small fingers buried themselves deeper in Scout's fur, and the dog responded by pressing closer to her side. Sarah fought back tears of frustration. For a brief, shining moment, her daughter had spoken, clear, purposeful words directed at Frank during the crisis. Now that moment had passed, and Emily had retreated once more into her silent world. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, stroking Emily's hair. "You don't have to talk. You were so brave today." Hours passed in the surgical waiting area. Sheriff Matthews arrived, his uniform still damp and muddy, to check on all involved and provide an update. "The vehicle is definitely Richard Colson's Navigator," he confirmed to Sarah. "Disappeared the same night he did, 22 years ago. We found human remains in the trunk," Sarah gasped. "Richard Colson, the town benefactor." Matthews nodded grimly. "And that's not all. We've taken Greg Bentley into custody. When we searched his property, we found a makeshift garage with tools and evidence he'd recently worked on the Navigator. Looks like he pulled it from the Quicksand privately some time ago, then dumped it back with Jessica inside after attacking her." "That's horrific," Sarah managed, glancing to ensure Emily wasn't listening closely. The little girl remained curled against Scout, her eyes vacant with exhaustion. "Jessica is Richard Colson's daughter," Matthews continued. "She's been investigating her father's disappearance for years. Apparently, she found something that led her to Bentley, confronted him, and—" He trailed off, nodding toward the treatment area where Jessica was recovering. A surgeon emerged from the restricted area, still in scrubs, looking exhausted. "Family of Frank Donovan," he called. Sarah stood, surprising herself with how quickly she moved to identify herself. "We're with him," she said, gesturing to Emily and Scout. The surgeon's expression was grave. "Mr. Donovan suffered a massive heart attack during the rescue. We've placed stents to open the blocked arteries, but his heart sustained significant damage. The next 48 hours will be critical." "But he'll live," Sarah pressed. "If he makes it through the night, his chances improve." The surgeon replied carefully, "His age and previous heart condition complicate matters. But he's surprisingly strong for a man in his condition. Must have been taking good care of himself." As the surgeon departed, an animal control officer arrived, clipboard in hand. "I'm here about the dog," he announced, eyeing Scout warily. Emily's head snapped up, her arms tightening around Scout's neck. The German shepherd remained perfectly calm, though his eyes tracked the officer's movements. "I'm afraid policy is clear," the officer stated, reviewing his paperwork. "No owner, no identification, and it's a restricted breed. He'll need to come to the shelter for assessment and holding." "No." Emily's voice startled everyone, the single word explosive in its intensity. Sarah knelt beside her daughter. "Emily, sweetie, Scout needs to be checked by a vet and cleaned up. He might have a microchip that tells us who he belongs to." "He belongs to Mr. Frank," Emily insisted, her words halting but clear. "He saved us. Both of us." The animal control officer shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I understand the situation is unusual, but regulations require—" Surely there's some accommodation we can make. Sarah interrupted. This dog just participated in rescuing a kidnapping victim and may have military training. He's shown no aggression whatsoever, despite Sarah's advocacy. Regulations prevailed. Scout was eventually led away by the animal control officer, though it took considerable coaxing and Emily's tearful whispered permission before he would leave her side. As the German shepherd disappeared down the hallway, Emily's face crumpled, and she curled into herself, refusing comfort from her mother or hospital staff. That night, Sarah divided her attention between her traumatized daughter, who refused to eat or acknowledge anyone, and checking on Frank's condition in the ICU. The hospital made an exception to allow her access due to her staff status, though Emily was not permitted in the critical care area. Frank lay unnaturally still among the machines keeping him alive, his weathered face slack, showing none of the determination that had driven him into floodwaters to save a stranger. The cardiac monitor beeped steadily, each tone a small victory against death. "You have to pull through," Sarah whispered, surprising herself with the emotion behind her words. "Emily needs you. That dog needs you. Hell, I think this whole town might need you." In the shelter across town, Scout sat alert in his kennel, ignoring the food provided, his intelligent eyes fixed on the door. Despite the staff's kindness, he remained aloof, his military training evident in his perfect posture and watchful gaze. When the night attendant made his rounds, he found the German shepherd in exactly the same position hours later, as if standing guard against an unseen threat. Morning brought news that further complicated the already tangled situation. The town council called an emergency meeting to address the discovery of Richard Colson's remains and the arrest of Greg Bentley. Plans for a memorial service began to circulate, focusing more on the town's loss of a benefactor than on the victim himself. At the hospital, Frank's condition remained critical but stable. The nurses reported that during the night, his vital signs had briefly deteriorated before inexplicably strengthening again, as if some internal resolve had reasserted itself. Emily remained withdrawn, her brief verbal breakthrough seemingly forgotten as she retreated deeper into silence. When Sarah attempted to explain that Scout was safe at the shelter, the little girl simply turned away, closing her eyes against a world that had once again taken something precious from her. Frank awakened to the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell that defined hospitals worldwide. His eyelids felt weighted, but he forced them open, squinting against the fluorescent lighting. A dull ache radiated from his chest, familiar but more intense than his usual angina. "Welcome back to the land of the living, soldier." Frank turned his head slightly to find Sheriff Matthews sitting in a vinyl chair beside the bed, hat in his hands. The lawman looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a 5 o'clock shadow that suggested he hadn't left the hospital in some time. "How long?" Frank's voice emerged as a rasp. "3 days," Matthews replied, reaching for a plastic cup of water and helping Frank take a sip. "You had us worried. Massive heart attack right there in the flood water. The docs say it's a miracle you made it." Frank's foggy mind began assembling fragments of memory: the rescue, the navigator, Scout pulling the woman through the window, the crushing pain that had dropped him to his knees in the rising water. After that, nothing. "The woman?" he asked. Matthews leaned forward. "Alive. Thanks to you and that remarkable dog. Her name's Jessica Colson." Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. Colson, as in Richard Colson's daughter, Matthews confirmed. She disappeared 2 weeks ago from Phoenix. Everyone assumed she'd run off like young people sometimes do. Turns out she'd discovered something about her father's disappearance and came to Willow Creek to investigate. Frank struggled to make sense of this information. She was in a vehicle that's been underwater for 20 years. No, Matthews said, shaking his head. That's where things get interesting. The Navigator we pulled out was indeed Richard Colson's vehicle from 2001, but someone had recently recovered it privately, hidden it, then dumped it back with Jessica inside after attacking her. Greg Bentley, Frank guessed, remembering Scout's reaction to the man. Matthews nodded grimly. Got it in one. When we searched his property, we found a makeshift garage with evidence he'd been working on the Navigator. Looks like Jessica tracked her father's old vehicle to Bentley, confronted him, and he decided to shut her up permanently poetic justice in his twisted mind to put her in the same grave as her father. Frank absorbed this, his mind moving slowly through the implications. So Richard Colson's remains were in the vehicle, in the trunk, Matthews confirmed. Forensics confirmed it yesterday. Gunshot wound to the head. Bentley killed him 22 years ago, embezzled funds from the Colson Foundation, and has been living off them ever since while playing the role of grieving assistant who took over the philanthropy. The sheriff stood, stretching his back. The real kicker. He'd been secretly draining the foundation for years. When Jessica started asking questions about discrepancies in the old accounts, he panicked. The foundation's annual audit was coming up next month, and everything would have unraveled anyway. Frank closed his eyes, processing the information. One question remained paramount in his mind. Scout. Matthew's expression softened. That dog hasn't left the hospital since they brought you in. He's outside right now with the Harper girl. Hospital made an exception about animals when the child refused to speak to anyone unless Scout was present. Relief washed over Frank. Good, he murmured. That's good. There's something else you should know, Matthews said, his tone changing. While you were out, I made some calls about that dog. Military Working Dog Program confirmed he was part of their breeding stock, direct descendant of a canine named Sergeant that served in Vietnam. Frank's heart monitor spiked momentarily. Sergeant was my partner, he said quietly. Best dog the Army ever had. Saved my entire unit in 71. Matthews nodded. So I gathered Scout, or Ajax, as he was designated, was being trained for deployment when he washed out of the program 6 months ago. Too gentle, they said. Wouldn't engage aggressively enough for combat operations. They were transitioning him to search and rescue when he escaped during a training exercise in the Huachuca Mountains. How'd he end up in Willow Creek? Frank asked. Matthews shrugged. Dogs can travel hundreds of miles to find what they're looking for. The military handlers had a theory, though. They said working dogs sometimes seek out handlers with similar energy to their trainers. When I told them about you... The sheriff trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. Frank turned away, unwilling to let Matthews see the emotion this revelation triggered. After a moment, he cleared his throat. And the Harper girl, Emily. That's another minor miracle, Matthews said. She's talking again, not a lot, and mostly about Scout. But the doctors say the trauma of almost losing the dog, then watching him save that woman, somehow broke through whatever was blocking her speech. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah Harper stood in the doorway, Emily half hidden behind her legs. Scout sat at perfect attention beside the child, his intelligent eyes fixed on Frank. "The nurse said you were awake," Sarah said. "Emily wanted to see you." Frank attempted to sit up straighter, wincing at the pain. "Come in," he invited, his gruff voice softening. Emily approached the bed cautiously, her small hand buried in Scout's fur. The German shepherd maintained perfect hospital manners, moving slowly and calmly beside her. "Mr. Frank?" Emily said, her voice small but clear. "Scout was worried about you." Frank smiled despite himself. "Was he now? Well, I'm tougher than I look." Emily nodded solemnly. "That's what I told him, but he still wanted to check." Sarah stepped forward. "We can't stay long. The doctors say you need rest. But Emily's been drawing pictures for you." She placed a folder on the bedside table. "And we wanted to thank you for everything." Frank nodded awkwardly, uncomfortable with gratitude. "The dog did the real work." "That's not true," Sarah insisted. "You recognized what he was, what he could do. You gave Emily her voice back, and you nearly died saving a stranger." Matthews stood, placing his hat on his head. "I should get back to the station. The FBI is sending a forensic team to help process Bentley's property. 22 years of evidence to sort through." He nodded to Frank. "Rest up, Donovan. We'll need your full statement when you're stronger." After the sheriff departed, an awkward silence filled the room. Frank had never been good with children or emotional situations, and now he faced both. To his surprise, Emily broke the tension. "I drew Scout rescuing the lady," she said, reaching into the folder her mother had brought and pulling out a crayon drawing. "See, he's swimming." Frank accepted the picture, studying the child's rendering of the dramatic rescue. Despite the simplistic style, Emily had captured something essential about Scout's determined posture as he pulled Jessica Colson from the vehicle. "That's exactly how he did it," Frank confirmed. "You've got a good eye." Emily beamed at the praise. "Mom says Scout can visit you every day until you're better." Frank glanced at Sarah, who nodded confirmation. "The hospital made an exception. Apparently they're considering Scout for their therapy dog program after what happened." "He'd be good at that," Frank agreed. "He's got the temperament for it." Emily leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I told Scout about your dog from the war, the one who was brave." Frank's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Did you now?" Emily nodded. "He liked that story. I think he wants to be brave like his grandpa dog." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Donovan needs his rest now." Sarah took Emily's hand. "We'll come back tomorrow," she promised. "Come on. Emily, Scout, come." To everyone's surprise, Scout didn't move. The German shepherd remained seated beside Frank's bed, his posture indicating a decision had been made. "Scout," Sarah called again. "Come on, boy." Frank recognized the dog's stance. It was the same immovable determination he'd seen in Sargent whenever the dog had detected a threat his handler hadn't yet recognized. "It's okay," Frank said softly. "I think he wants to stay a while." The nurse looked dubious. "Hospital policy is flexible in special cases," interrupted a new voice. "Dr. Mendez." The cardiologist who had saved Frank's life entered the room. "The Therapy Dog Committee has approved Scout for a provisional therapy assignment." She winked at Emily. "And his first patient just happens to be Mr. Donovan." Emily's face lit up. "Can he really stay?" Dr. Mendez nodded. "We've made arrangements. But you'll have to come walk him 3 times a day and bring his food. Deal?" "Deal," Emily agreed instantly. As Sarah and Emily prepared to leave, Frank felt a weight lift from his chest that had nothing to do with his medical condition. For 20 years, he'd carried survivors' guilt over Sargent's sacrifice. The dog had died saving him and their unit, a debt Frank had never felt he could repay. Now, in a twist of fate too perfect to be coincidence, Sargent's descendant had appeared in Frank's life just when he was needed most. Not for combat, but for healing, both physical and emotional. After the Harpers left, Frank studied the German shepherd who had taken up vigilant position beside his bed. "So you found me after all these years?" he murmured. "Took you long enough?" Scout's ears twitched forward, his intelligent eyes never leaving Frank's face. "You know," Frank continued quietly, "I never got to thank Sargent properly. He was gone before I could tell him what he meant to me." Scout inched closer, resting his muzzle gently on the edge of the hospital bed. Frank placed his weathered hand on the dog's head. "Different dog, same soul," he whispered. "That's what the old handlers used to say. The best ones come back to you when you need them most." As Frank drifted back toward sleep, comforted by Scout's presence, the hospital room door opened again. Jessica Colson, still pale but recovering, wheeled herself in quietly. "Mr. Donovan," she said softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Frank's eyes opened. "Not at all," he replied, struggling to sit up straighter. Jessica wheeled closer, her expression solemn. "They told me what you did. You and this amazing dog." She reached out hesitantly, and Scout gently sniffed her hand before allowing her to pet him. "The doctors say I wouldn't have survived another 30 minutes in that water." "Scout did the hard part," Frank deflected. Jessica shook her head. "Sheriff Matthews told me about your heart condition. You knew going into that water could kill you." Frank remained silent, uncomfortable with praise. "I've been searching for answers about my father for years." Jessica continued. "Everyone told me to let it go, that he'd abandoned us for a new life somewhere. I never believed it." Her voice caught. "Now, I finally know the truth. I'm sorry about your father." Frank offered awkwardly. "I'm still processing it," Jessica admitted. "But at least now we can lay him to rest properly, and Bentley will face justice." She hesitated, then added, "The sheriff showed me the old case files. My father was trying to expose financial irregularities in the town council when he disappeared. He was killed for doing the right thing." Frank nodded, understanding the complex emotions that came with such revelations. "Knowing the truth matters," he said simply. "Even when it hurts." Jessica studied him thoughtfully. "You're good at finding truth. Mr. Donovan, the sheriff mentioned you were a detective before you retired." "Long time ago," Frank acknowledged. "The Colson Foundation needs someone with integrity to help rebuild it." Jessica said, Someone who understands investigation and can help us recover what Bentley stole over the years. She gave him a meaningful look. Once you're recovered, of course. Frank blinked in surprise at the implicit job offer before he could formulate a response. Scout's head lifted sharply, his attention focused on the door. Emily appeared, clutching a drawing she'd forgotten to leave. "Sorry," she said shyly, noticing Jessica. "I just wanted to give Mr. Frank one more picture." 1 month later, Frank stood at the edge of what had once been the sinking grounds. The summer heat had baked the mud into a cracked, hard surface, erasing all evidence of the drama that had unfolded there. The town had erected a temporary fence around the area, with plans to transform it into a proper park, the Richard Colson Memorial Park, funded by the foundation that bore his name. "Penny for your thoughts." Sarah Harper approached, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the Main Street diner. She handed one to Frank, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Just thinking about how different things look in the daylight," Frank replied, taking a careful sip. "When everything's dried out and put back together." Sarah understood his meaning went beyond the landscape. In the month since the rescue, Willow Creek had experienced a transformation nearly as dramatic as the physical terrain. The discovery of Richard Colson's remains and the arrest of Greg Bentley had forced the town to confront long-buried secrets and divisions. "Emily's teacher says she's talking more every day," Sarah said, changing the subject to something more hopeful. "Still quiet compared to other kids, but she's participating in class discussions now. Dr. Levine says her progress is remarkable." Frank smiled slightly. "She's a tough kid. Resilient. Like someone else I know," Sarah replied, giving him a meaningful look. "The doctors can't believe how quickly you've recovered. They're calling it miraculous." Frank shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. His cardiologist had indeed been amazed by his recovery, attributing it to a combination of stubborn determination and the constant presence of his therapy dog. Scout had barely left Frank's side during his 2-week hospital stay, somehow understanding exactly when to alert nurses to changes in Frank's condition before the monitors could detect them. "Speaking of miracles," Frank said, nodding toward the approaching figures. "Here comes our girl." Emily skipped toward them, Scout trotting faithfully at her side. The German Shepherd wore a new vest, blue, with patches identifying him as a therapy dog in training. Behind them walked Jessica Colson, now fully recovered from her ordeal, carrying a stack of papers and looking every bit the foundation director she had become. "Mr. Frank?" Emily called, waving excitedly. "We got the permits. Scout can officially visit the children's ward starting next week." Frank knelt carefully to receive Emily's enthusiastic hug, still mindful of his healing chest. "That's excellent news. Deputy, you two will do great work there." Emily beamed at the title. Frank had taken to calling her his deputy since accepting Jessica's offer to help reorganize the Colson Foundation and recover the misappropriated funds. Emily had appointed herself his assistant, taking the role very seriously. "I've been practicing the commands you taught me," she reported. "Scout sits and stays for almost 10 minutes now, even when I walk away." 10 minutes. Frank feigned astonishment. "That's better than most deputies I've known." Jessica joined their small group, smiling at the interaction. "The hospital administrator is impressed with Scout's credentials," she told Sarah. "Having military training and natural therapy instincts is apparently quite rare. Not to mention his newfound celebrity status," Sarah added dryly. The hero dog of Willow Creek has quite the following now." It was true. The video one of the teenagers had posted of Scouts' rescue efforts had gone viral, bringing national attention to their small town. Animal Planet had already contacted them about featuring Scout in a documentary about exceptional working dogs. The military liaison called again. Jessica informed Frank, handing him one of the papers she carried. "They've officially released all claims to Scout. He's yours legally now, though they'd appreciate access for their breeding program eventually." Frank nodded, accepting the document without reading it. The Army's K-9 program had been surprisingly accommodating once they understood the circumstances. As one gruff sergeant had put it during a video call, "That dog found exactly where he was supposed to be. Who are we to argue with that kind of precision?" "Sheriff Matthews asked me to remind you about the town council meeting tonight," Jessica continued. "They're voting on the memorial design, and he thinks your input would be valuable." Frank suppressed a grimace. He'd spent decades avoiding community involvement, preferring solitude to the complications of social connections. Now, somehow, he found himself at the center of Willow Creek's healing process, a reluctant elder statesman whose opinion was sought on matters ranging from the Colson investigation to the design of park benches. "I suppose I could stop by," he conceded, knowing Emily would insist on accompanying him. The child had appointed herself his social coordinator, gradually drawing him out of isolation with an innocent persistence he couldn't refuse. "Before I forget," Sarah said, reaching into her purse, "Mrs. Abernathy made you another casserole. She said, and I quote, 'That man's too skinny by half, and I aim to fix it before winter.'" Frank accepted the note with Mrs. Abernathy's reheating instructions, touched despite himself by the neighborhood's persistent kindness. After years of keeping people at arm's length, he was discovering that small-town community had its advantages, particularly when one had survived a near-death experience that the entire town had witnessed. "The memorial service is set for Saturday," Jessica said more soberly. "They've finished processing Dad's remains. It would mean a lot if you could all be there." "Of course," Sarah assured her, placing a comforting hand on Jessica's arm. The two women had formed an unexpected friendship, united by their experiences as single mothers navigating difficult circumstances. Emily, who had been quietly petting Scout, looked up at the mention of the memorial. "Will there be lots of people?" she asked, a hint of her old anxiety returning. Frank recognized the concern in her voice. Despite her progress, crowds still overwhelmed Emily sometimes, triggering her tendency to retreat into silence. "Tell you what, Deputy," Frank said, kneeling to her level again. "Scout and I will be right beside you the whole time. If it gets to be too much, we'll create a diversion so you can make a tactical retreat. Deal?" Emily's expression brightened. "What kind of diversion?" "The best kind," Frank assured her with a wink. "The kind no one expects." Sarah rolled her eyes, but her smile betrayed her amusement. "Please don't teach my daughter covert ops techniques." "Frank?" "Too late." "Mom," Emily giggled. "Mr. Frank already showed me 3 ways to disappear in a crowd." "Valuable life skills," Frank defended with mock seriousness. Their light moment was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Matthews' patrol SUV. The sheriff rolled down his window, nodding to the group. "Thought I'd find you all out here. Just got word from the FBI forensic team. They've confirmed Bentley's ties to at least 2 other disappearances over the years. Cold cases from neighboring counties with similar financial motives. The news sobered them all. Greg Bentley's crimes had proven more extensive than anyone initially suspected, extending beyond the murder of Richard Colson to a pattern of eliminating anyone who threatened to expose his financial schemes. "He'll never see daylight again," Matthews assured them, noting their expressions. "The prosecutor is talking multiple life sentences." He shifted focus, addressing Frank directly. "That tip you provided about checking the storage facility in his ex-wife's name was solid gold. Found documentation going back 20 years. The man kept records of everything." Frank nodded, unsurprised. Control freaks usually do. It's both their strength and their downfall. "Well, your investigative instincts haven't dulled with retirement," Matthews commented. "The offer to join us part-time as a consultant still stands, you know." Frank gave a non-committal grunt. Between his work with the Colson Foundation and his informal role mentoring Emily with Scouts training, his previously empty days were already fuller than he'd ever anticipated. "Think about it," Matthews said, recognizing Frank's hesitation. "No pressure. Just having you around has already made a difference." He tipped his hat to the ladies. "See you all at the council meeting." As the sheriff drove away, Emily tugged on Frank's sleeve. "You should do it," she said earnestly. "Scout and I could help. We're good at finding things." "Are you now?" Frank raised an eyebrow, amused by her confidence. "We found you, didn't we?" Emily replied with the simple logic of childhood. The statement struck Frank with unexpected force. This child, who had endured her own traumas and losses, saw their meeting not as chance but as something meaningful, a finding, a recognition. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "I suppose you did." Jessica checked her watch. "I should get back to the office. The Foundation audit team is coming at 3. She knelt to Emily's level. "Still on for our ice cream date tomorrow? I want to hear all about Scout's training progress." Emily nodded enthusiastically. Her friendship with Jessica had been another unexpected development the young woman had recognized in Emily, a determination similar to her own, and had taken to mentoring the child in what she called confident speaking. As Jessica departed, Sarah touched Frank's arm lightly. "I've got to get back to my shift at the hospital. Will you be okay taking Emily and Scout back to your place until Mrs. Abernathy can pick her up at 4? "We'll be fine," Frank assured her. "I promised to show her how to polish Scout's therapy badges properly. Very important official business." Sarah smiled, grateful for how naturally Frank had stepped into a grandfather-like role for Emily. "Don't let her talk you into ice cream before dinner again," she warned. "And no more war stories that give her nightmares." "Scout monitors my storytelling now," Frank replied solemnly. "He changes the subject when things get too exciting." After Sarah left for her hospital shift, Frank, Emily, and Scout walked slowly along the edge of the dried lake bed. The early autumn sunshine cast long shadows across the cracked earth, highlighting the transformation of what had once been a death trap into something new and full of possibility. "Mr. Frank?" Emily asked, her small hand slipping naturally into his weathered one. "Do you think Scout knew what was under the mud that day? Is that why he went there?" Frank considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think Scout follows his instincts, and his instincts are very good. Some might call it coincidence that he led us to that spot at that exact time. But I've lived too long to believe in coincidences that perfect." Emily nodded, satisfied with this answer. "Sometimes heroes get stuck, too," she said, repeating the phrase she'd first uttered during Frank's hospital stay. "But they still find a way to help." "That they do, Deputy," Frank agreed, squeezing her hand gently. "That they do." Scout trotted ahead of them, periodically looking back as if to ensure they were following. The German shepherd's posture reflected a confidence and purpose that reminded Frank powerfully of Sergeant "Different dog, same soul," as the old handlers used to say. As they turned toward home, Frank's house that was no longer a solitary outpost, but a gathering place for their unlikely family, Frank felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. The quicksand that had nearly claimed Emily and Scout had ultimately freed them all, bringing to the surface not just long-buried secrets, but also connections that were healing wounds Frank had thought permanent. "What should we name the puppies when Scout has them?" Emily asked suddenly, skipping beside him.
"Jessica says the military wants Scout to have puppies someday for their program." Frank chuckled. "Let's cross that bridge when we come to it. Deputy, one hero dog at a time is plenty for now." Scout barked once, as if in agreement, and led them home beneath the golden autumn sky. Sometimes life buries our greatest treasures beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Like Frank Donovan, many of us have carried the weight of past sacrifices and losses, building walls around our hearts that we believed would protect us from further pain. We tell ourselves that solitude is safer than connection, that our stories are better left untold. But as Frank discovered through a child's unwavering devotion and a remarkable dog's loyalty, it's never too late for healing to begin. The quicksand moments in our lives, those terrifying times when we feel ourselves sinking, often become the very circumstances that reveal our true strength and connect us to the companions we never knew we needed. Whether you're 55 or 85, your story isn't finished. Your experience matters. Your capacity to reach out, to protect, to love again